Imagine you've spent all day hauling buckets of water from a frozen stream, breaking your back in a muddy field, or scraping grime off a stone floor in a cold, drafty castle. You're starving. Your stomach's rumbling loud enough to scare away the crows. So you rush home to eat, and what's waiting for you? Eating. A bowl of grey sludge that smells like wet socks. Maybe some stale bread so hard you could use it as a weapon. And if it's a special day, if the harvest was good, and nobody in your village died that week, you might get lucky and find a slice of dried turnip floating in the mess. Bon appétit, peasant. Welcome to the world of medieval food, where flavor went to die and dinner was usually a punishment. You see, when we picture the Middle Ages, most of us imagine kings and queens feasting at grand banquet tables, dripping with roasted meats and goblets of wine. But that wasn't reality for most people. In fact, unless you were born into serious wealth, food in the medieval world sucked badly. It was bland, dangerous, monotonous, and often flat-out disgusting. And it wasn't just because people didn't know how to cook. No, the problem went deeper, into how they lived, how they worked, what they believed, and what was even possible in a world without refrigerators, running water, or a basic understanding of bacteria. So here's what did people eat in the Middle Ages, and why was it so consistently awful? Let's start with the basics. For peasants, the vast majority of the population, meals revolved around something called pottage. Now, pottage sounds kind of fancy, right? Like maybe something you'd get at a rustic pub with a side of crusty bread. Nope. It was basically soup made from whatever you could scrape together. Onions, leeks, old cabbage, and the occasional carrot if you were lucky. No spices, no salt, no meat. Just boiling mush, eaten with fingers or chunks of rock-hard bread used as spoons. That bread, by the way, it was made with coarse rye or barley flour. Wheat was too expensive for most people, and because flour wasn't sifted, it often came with some bonus ingredients, like bits of grit, pieces of bone from the millstone, and sometimes even insects. After a few years of eating that, it wasn't just your taste buds that suffered. Your teeth wore down. Peasants in the Middle Ages often had the dental records of someone who'd been chewing gravel. But even bad bread was better than no bread. And if there was a bad harvest, if the weather turned cold or the crops got hit by disease, things went from miserable to deadly fast. In the worst times, people turned to famine foods. That meant grinding up tree bark or boiling grass. Some accounts tell of desperate families eating moss, boiled leather, or dead animals found in the street. Others simply starved. And then there were the diseases. Without clean water, good hygiene, or food preservation, medieval kitchens were basically breeding grounds for bacteria. Meat went bad quickly, cheese spoiled, grains grew mold. And when you're hungry enough, you don't throw food out. You eat it, rotten, slimy, buzzing with flies. If it filled your stomach, you swallowed it. That's how people ended up dying from dinner. One of the deadliest medieval killers was something called ergot poisoning. This happened when rye was infected by a fungus during wet seasons. People didn't know it was toxic, so they ate the bread anyway. The result? Seizures, hallucinations, burning skin, limbs turning black, fingers falling off. It was like being eaten alive from the inside out, and that was just one type of bread. Let's talk about meat. Most peasants didn't get much. If they did, it was usually pork, cured and salted within an inch of its life, often covered in mold and sometimes crawling with maggots. Preservation techniques were basic. Smoke it, dry it, salt it, or lose it. And if you were too poor to afford enough salt, too bad. Enjoy your bacteria buffet. Fish was more common, but not always better. In fact, fish was often dried so thoroughly it had to be smashed with a hammer before cooking. That's not a joke. There are records of people using mallets to soften dried cod before boiling it into tasteless glue. And that brings us to flavor. You might think, okay, food was simple, but surely they had some spices. Well, yes and no. Spices were incredibly valuable in medieval Europe. Cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg, saffron, these weren't kitchen staples. They were luxury items, imported at great cost, guarded like treasure and mostly reserved for the nobility. The average person seasoned their food with what they could grow. Onions, garlic, leeks, and herbs like parsley or thyme. Sometimes vinegar, sometimes honey, but most of the time, nothing. Just hot, wet, bitter mush. Even water wasn't safe. Medieval people often avoided drinking water because it was so easily contaminated. Wells and rivers were filled with waste, both human and animal, and waterborne diseases were everywhere. That's why ale and wine were popular, even among children, not because everyone was trying to get drunk, but because boiled and fermented liquids were safer than the local pond. Let that sink in. Your daily drink might have been warm beer because the water could kill you, but even alcohol wasn't always clean. Sometimes ale was stretched with weird ingredients like tree bark, soot, or poisonous herbs to make it last longer. That's when things got really dangerous. Meanwhile, up in the castles and courts, the nobles were living a different kind of food nightmare. Yes, they had more ingredients, better cuts of meat, and access to exotic spices, but they also lived in a time where too much was a flex. Bigger, richer, weirder. It was all about showing off. So meals became grotesque displays of overindulgence. Ever seen a roasted peacock served with its feathers reattached? That happened. How about meat pies filled with live birds that flew out when you cut into them? Totally real. How about stuffing one animal inside another? Yep. Turducken had medieval ancestors and they were just as weird. But again, no refrigeration. So even the best meats went bad fast. Nobles might be eating gold-dusted boar and still get violently sick from spoiled gravy. And guess what? Doctors didn't understand bacteria either. So if you vomited or had stomach cramps, you weren't told to avoid bad food. You were told your humors were out of balance and maybe someone should bleed you. That's medieval medicine, by the way. Cut people open and hope for the best. Still hungry? Too bad. Because we haven't even gotten to fasting. Religion played a massive role in how, when, and what people ate. The church set strict rules. No meat on Fridays, no food at all on certain fast days, and long periods like Lent, where people had to go vegetarian, whether they liked it or not. Monks might eat only one meal a day. Some religious orders gave up meat entirely. Others allowed fish, but not mammals. So people got creative and sneaky. One loophole: beavers. Since they lived in water and had tails kind of like fish, some people decided beavers counted as fish and ate them during fasts. That's not a joke. The church literally had to issue statements clarifying that, no, beavers are not fish. But by then, people had already eaten them. So let's talk about bread. You might think bread was a simple, safe staple for medieval people, but in many cases, it was a silent killer. While the nobility had soft white bread made from finely milled wheat, peasants were stuck with something called maslin bread, a miserable mix of rye, barley, and whatever else they could scrape together. On good days it was coarse and dry. On bad days it was moldy, green, and potentially toxic. The rye in this bread sometimes contained a fungus called ergot, a hallucinogenic mold that could cause seizures, burning sensations in the limbs, and in extreme cases, gangrene. Yes, actual rotting of the limbs. This condition was known as St. Anthony's fire, and people thought it was a curse or divine punishment. In reality, it was just rotten bread, and even when the bread wasn't tainted, it could still be dangerous. Bakers often padded their flour with chalk, sawdust, or even clay to stretch their ingredients and make more money. Imagine biting into a loaf and cracking your tooth on a rock. That was a very real risk. You could literally die from bread by choking, poisoning, or infection from a broken tooth. Meat, that was a luxury. And when people did get meat, it was usually tough, stringy, and dangerously undercooked. Remember, there were no refrigerators, no freezers, and no real understanding of bacteria. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried, but even then, it would spoil quickly. Sometimes cooks would cover the smell of rotten meat with spices, if they could afford them. Not to improve the flavor, but to trick people into thinking it was edible. Nobles might throw elaborate feasts with peacock or boar, but those animals were often days past their prime. By the time it hit the table, that beautiful roast was already crawling with bacteria. And fish, even worse. Medieval people were obsessed with religious fasting, no meat on Fridays or during Lent, so fish became a staple. But without ice or modern preservation, fresh fish was almost impossible to find if you didn't live near the sea. Most fish was dried, salted to death, and tough as leather. The monks in monasteries were known to eat fish 5 days a week, but don't imagine them dining on fresh salmon or tuna. More often they were gnawing on ancient herring or salted eel. And if it wasn't preserved correctly, that fish could make you violently ill. The smell alone was enough to make you lose your appetite. Imagine being forced to eat spoiled, rubbery fish day after day as an act of religious devotion. Now let's talk about the absolute horror that was medieval dairy. Today we take clean, cold milk for granted. In the Middle Ages, not a chance. There was no refrigeration, no pasteurization, and cows were not treated with any sense of hygiene. Milk would spoil within hours. Butter was yellowish-gray and often full of hair, dirt, or bugs. Cheese, it was either rock-hard or alarmingly slimy. Sometimes it was intentionally rotten because aging food made it easier to digest. People made cheese in open air, often in wooden buckets that were never fully cleaned. The result? Cheese that was alive, maggots, mold, and all. But they ate it anyway, because protein was hard to come by, and waste was not an option. They just cut off the worst parts and hoped for the best. Even the water was dangerous. Clean drinking water was almost impossible to find. Rivers were full of waste, from humans, animals, and entire villages. People dumped their trash, their chamber pots, even their dead animals into local streams. Unsurprisingly, cholera, dysentery, and typhoid spread like wildfire. To avoid contaminated water, many people, including children, drank ale instead. Not strong beer like we know it today, but a weak, low-alcohol version called small ale. It was safer than water, but still often foul-tasting. Sometimes it was flavored with herbs or fruit to cover the bitter taste, but brewers cut corners all the time. Some used moldy grain. Others reused yeast too many times, resulting in weird textures and disgusting smells. And don't think wine was any better. Most of the wine consumed in medieval Europe was sour, cloudy, and full of sediment. They didn't have corks or glass bottles, so wine was stored in wooden barrels that often leaked or rotted. Aged wine was not a delicacy. It was a curse. Many people added honey, herbs, or even lead to sweeten it and make it palatable. Yes, lead, which slowly poisoned their brains. Now imagine you're a peasant, and you finally sit down for dinner after a long day breaking your back in the fields. What's on the menu? Pottage, a thin stew made from old root vegetables, grains, and maybe a bone or two for flavor. No spices, no salt, and no meat unless you were lucky. The stew was cooked over an open fire and left to simmer for days, with new ingredients tossed in as they were found. It was the medieval version of leftovers forever. Sometimes they added wild herbs like nettles or dandelions. Sometimes they added whatever animal they could catch. A squirrel, a hedgehog, maybe even a frog. You ate what you had, not what you wanted. Dessert, don't even think about it. Sugar was incredibly rare and expensive. If you were a noble, maybe you got candied fruit or honey pastries once in a while. If you were poor, your idea of a treat might be a crust of stale bread dipped in watered-down ale. And forget about snacks. There were no cookies, chips, or chocolate. Chocolate didn't even exist in Europe yet. Potatoes? Nope. Tomatoes? Also no. Corn? Absolutely not. All of those came after the Columbian Exchange, centuries later. Most medieval diets were low in calories and low in nutrients. People were often malnourished, stunted in growth, and constantly hungry. Their teeth rotted out from grain-heavy diets. Their bones became brittle. Scurvy and rickets were common. And food poisoning? That was practically a rite of passage. Even the wealthy weren't immune. Kings and queens might have more food, but they also had more problems. Too much red meat and sweet wine gave them gout, also known as the disease of kings. Their sedentary lifestyles and overindulgence made them bloated, sickly, and often prematurely dead. One nobleman was said to have died from overeating lampreys, eel-like fish that were considered a delicacy. Others fell ill from spoiled poultry or exotic dishes that had gone bad on the journey from distant lands. The more lavish the meal, the greater the risk. Food was a gamble. Every meal was a potential disaster. And yet people ate. They had to, because hunger was worse than the risk. So why did food suck so much in medieval times? Because everything that could go wrong did. Bad hygiene, no refrigeration, ignorance of germs, widespread poverty, and a brutal climate meant food was either rotten, bland, or dangerously contaminated. It was a constant struggle for survival, and the dinner table was just another battlefield. But let's not pretend the nobility had it all figured out either. Sure, they had food in abundance, but that didn't mean it was good. In fact, some of the things they ate would make you gag. Take swan, for example. Yes, actual swans. These majestic creatures were roasted and served at feasts, not because they tasted amazing, but because they looked impressive on a plate. The same went for peacocks. Cooks would go to great lengths to roast the bird, and then redress it in its own feathers before bringing it out to the dining hall like it was some sort of feathered Frankenstein. It wasn't about flavor, it was about flexing. Many of the spices nobles used weren't chosen for taste either. They were symbols of wealth and status. Exotic spices like saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg traveled thousands of miles from Asia and the Middle East to reach medieval Europe, they were outrageously expensive and usually tossed into dishes without much understanding of how to use them. The result: over-seasoned, chaotic meals that reeked more of ego than flavor. Imagine throwing cinnamon and cloves into a meat pie and calling it dinner. Congratulations. You've just made a medieval delicacy. Then there were the food customs that today would seem absolutely bizarre. For instance, medieval cooks often used almond milk, not because it was a trendy vegan substitute, but because milk from animals spoiled quickly without refrigeration. The solution? Soak ground almonds in water and strain it. It kept longer, didn't spoil as easily, and gave the illusion of richness. But this wasn't just a life hack, it was a necessity. Animal milk, especially in summer, could go sour fast. So nobody wanted to play Russian roulette with their porridge. And speaking of drinks, water wasn't exactly trustworthy either. Most people, peasants and nobles alike, drank ale on a daily basis, including children. Not because they were raging alcoholics, but because ale was boiled during brewing and therefore safer than raw, untreated water. You'd drink weak ale with breakfast, stronger ale with dinner, and maybe a stronger brew during festivals. It was liquid bread, a medieval Gatorade. And while it was safer than the water, that didn't mean it was always clean. Quality varied wildly. Sometimes it was thick, sour, or weak as ditch water. Still, it was better than dying from cholera. Salt was another essential, not for seasoning, but for preservation. Since there were no refrigerators, meat had to be heavily salted or smoked to keep it from rotting. The result: meat so salty it could dry out your soul. It had to be soaked in water for hours before it was even edible. If you were lucky. If not, well, you just got used to chewing something that tasted like jerky, soaked in ocean brine. And preservation wasn't just about meat. Bread could be preserved in strange ways too. In some places it was so dense and dry that it was almost inedible. Enter the trencher, a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate. You'd pile your food on top, eat the contents, and maybe, just maybe, someone would eat the bread plate afterward. Usually, though, it got tossed to the dogs or the poor. Because let's be honest, eating your plate is depressing, even by medieval standards. But here's the thing. Bad food wasn't just about taste, it could be lethal. Food poisoning was common, and the lack of scientific understanding meant people had no idea what caused it. Spoiled meat, bad fish, no one knew. So instead of fixing the problem, they prayed, or blamed witches, or blamed their own sinful thoughts. Medicine of the day couldn't help much either. Doctors might prescribe crushed pearls, mercury, or bloodletting as a cure for a stomachache. That's not dinner and a remedy, that's dinner and a death sentence. There's one horrifying account of an English noblewoman in the 14th century who fell violently ill after a feast. Her attendants assumed she had been cursed. The cook was beaten. Prayers were offered. Holy relics were placed near her bedside. No one thought to check the stew. Why would they? The stew was made from meat that had been preserved in salt for months and then stewed with cabbage, garlic, and vinegar until it became a grey slop. Everyone ate it. Everyone got sick. No one learned. And let's not forget the psychological impact of medieval food. When your entire life is built around survival, food becomes a source of anxiety, not joy. Will you eat tomorrow? Will the harvest be good? Will your bread kill you or save you? Will the bishop take your last chicken as a tithe? Every meal was a negotiation with fate. Even religious fasts became dangerous. Monks, for example, were required to abstain from meat during certain times of the year. But they got clever. They reclassified beavers as fish so they could keep eating them during Lent. Yes, beaver. Apparently, if it swims, it's seafood. That was the logic. It's hard not to admire the creativity, but also it's hard not to cringe. But not every region had it equally bad. Northern Europe had its own horrors. Sure, but in Southern Europe, things were a little more flavorful thanks to stronger Roman culinary traditions and closer trade routes. Still, even in Italy and Spain, food quality depended heavily on class. A peasant in Sicily might have access to olives, bread and some dried fish, but a noble might feast on dishes with saffron and sugar, imported at enormous cost. So while the Mediterranean world fared better than its northern neighbors, the inequality remained sharp. Meanwhile, in cold, damp parts of Europe like Scandinavia or the British Isles, food was even more basic. There were fewer vegetables, fewer spices, and a whole lot of bland. Turnips, onions, oats, and dried fish formed the bulk of a Viking era or early medieval English diet. That's not a menu, it's a punishment, and yet somehow they survived, barely. Festivals were rare exceptions, when people could finally enjoy a wider variety of food. During these times, even the poor might get a taste of meat, cheese or honey-sweetened bread. But these moments of joy were fleeting. The rest of the time it was survival mode. Endless cycles of planting, harvesting, preserving, and praying. One historian even described medieval diets as a war between hunger and decay. You were either starving or fighting off food that was already going bad. There was no in-between. And yet medieval people adapted. They came up with countless methods of fermentation, drying and smoking. They built underground storage pits to keep root vegetables cool. They made vinegar from spoiled wine to preserve other foods. Every corner of Europe had its own regional survival strategies, from pickled cabbage in the east to oatcakes in the west. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't Instagram-worthy, but it was food. It kept them going. And in a world constantly teetering on the edge of famine, sometimes just surviving was an achievement worth celebrating. As much as nobles relished their power and riches, even they couldn't escape the stomach-churning dangers of food in medieval times. Spoiled meat wasn't just a peasant problem, it was a royal one too. Imagine being invited to a grand feast, tables lined with roasted swan, peacock, and boar, garnished with herbs and drenched in sauces so thick you couldn't taste the rot underneath. That was the point. Sauces weren't just for flavor. They were often used to hide the smell and taste of decaying meat. Without refrigeration, food started going bad within hours, and the cooks would drown it in spices, vinegar, or honey to make it bearable, or at least less obvious. No one at the table dared to complain. Speaking up could insult the host, who might be a powerful lord, or worse, the king himself. So they'd choke it down, say it was divine, and pray they didn't die of food poisoning the next morning. One of the most bizarre parts of medieval dining was their obsession with appearances. Food had to look extravagant, even if it tasted like leather dipped in mold. There was something called a cockentrice, a Frankenstein fusion of a pig and a bird. They'd sew half a piglet to half a goose, roast it, and serve it like it was a divine creation. This wasn't about taste, it was about ego. "Look how powerful I am," the dish screamed. "I made this culinary abomination just because I could." Meanwhile, the peasants were gnawing on stale barley bread that could break your teeth. But wait, let's talk about bread. because bread was the heart of every medieval diet. It was supposed to be the most basic, reliable food, but even that was a gamble, a huge one. If the weather ruined the wheat harvest or war disrupted trade routes, peasants couldn't bake wheat bread. Instead, they resorted to baking with rye, oats, acorns, or whatever else they could grind into powder. In desperate years, they'd bake bread from a blend of straw, moss, and even sawdust. Yes, sawdust. In some cases, eating this kind of bread actually killed people. One of the worst culprits was ergot, a deadly fungus that grew on rye. People didn't know it was poisonous, so they'd grind it into flour and bake it anyway. It caused convulsions, hallucinations, and rotting limbs. They called it St. Anthony's fire. Villages would wake up one morning, and suddenly half the population was writhing in agony, their fingers turning black and falling off, all because of bad bread. Even the church couldn't save them from the wrath of moldy carbs. And just when you think things can't get more disgusting, they could. Because the medieval market was full of con artists. You'd go to buy meat and realize that it was moving. Not because it was fresh, but because it was infested with maggots. Butchers would sprinkle ashes on it to hide the wriggling. Fishmongers would rub dead fish with brine or even manure to give them a fresh caught smell. Bread sellers would mix flour with chalk to save money, and if you dared complain, they might just accuse you of lying, or worse, witchcraft. Still hungry? Now imagine trying to eat all this with no utensils. Forks were considered sinful or effeminate. Real men ate with their fingers. If you were lucky, you had a spoon. But knives were usually shared and not washed between uses. You'd slice into a piece of mystery meat, pass the knife down the table, and someone else would dig it into a hunk of moldy cheese. Cross-contamination wasn't just likely, it was constant. Foodborne illness wasn't an exception, it was expected. And somehow the drink wasn't much better. Because yes, everyone drank beer, even kids. Water wasn't trusted, rightfully so. Most of it came from rivers or wells polluted with sewage, dead animals, and the occasional decomposing body. If you drank unboiled water, you were basically rolling the dice with dysentery. So beer and ale were the safer options. But they were weak, sour, and often spoiled. Alewives, the women who brewed beer, were sometimes accused of diluting their product or poisoning it. If someone got sick from a bad batch, mobs might accuse her of witchcraft. It was a dangerous job, but brewing was still essential, because without ale, the village would probably just die of thirst. And if you think this era cared about dessert, think again. Sugar was an expensive luxury from the East. Honey was more common, but even that wasn't guaranteed. Peasants rarely had sweets, and when they did, it wasn't cakes or pastries. It was flat, rock-hard biscuits baked with lard, flour, and maybe a dash of crushed nuts or dried fruit if they were lucky. Most people had never tasted chocolate, coffee, or citrus. Bananas were mythical. Tomatoes were feared. Potatoes were unknown. And spices. Spices were the food of kings and merchants. Salt, the most basic flavor enhancer we take for granted today, was so valuable it was literally used as currency. Wars were fought over salt mines. If you had a block of salt, you could trade it for livestock or a bride. And yet, people still had to salt their meat if they wanted to eat during the winter. Because without refrigeration, the only way to preserve meat was to drown it in salt, smoke it until it turned into leather, or dry it until it was like jerky, so tough it cracked your teeth. That was your dinner. Chew for 10 minutes. Swallow. Pray it doesn't kill you. But there's more. Oh, there's so much more. Let's talk about medieval fast food. Yes, that existed. In cities, some people didn't cook at home. They bought food from street vendors. But hygiene laws didn't exist. Food was sold from carts crawling with rats and flies. Hot pies, meat pasties, stews, all kept warm over smoky coals with no covers. Sometimes vendors reused old stew from the day before, or the day before that. Meat might have been cat, dog, or rat. No one knew. No one asked. You could buy a meat pie and realize halfway through that something was off. Maybe it was the texture, or the smell, or the tiny pore still inside. And yet, city folks kept buying it. Because they were hungry. Because they were poor. Because they didn't want to light a fire in a cramped wooden house and risk burning the entire street down. Because it was fast, cheap, and sometimes edible, but just barely. To be continued. In towns and cities, the food situation wasn't much better. Street vendors sold mystery meat pies, and no one really asked what animal or part of the animal was inside. The pies were greasy, undercooked, and sometimes crawling with maggots if left out too long. Sanitation? Not a thing. Open sewers ran through the streets. Rats scurried near bread stalls. And yet people ate with their hands, licked their fingers clean, and passed food around the table. Medieval city life was a gamble every time you bit into something. And don't forget the infamous black bread. Sounds poetic, right? But this wasn't some fancy rye loaf. This was bread made with flour so poor it was often laced with fungus, bark, or literal ground-up straw. Some loaves turned green with mold before they hit the table. And the worst part, many didn't have a choice. That moldy, inedible brick was the only food between them and starvation. Wheat, the grain of the wealthy, was tightly controlled. The best white bread was called manchet, and it was made from the finest sifted flour, so white it glowed compared to the brownish, rock-hard lumps peasants chewed on. A noble's dinner might start with manchet and wine. A peasant's dinner, maybe half a stale loaf and water from a stream shared with livestock. Now let's talk dairy. Milk was a gamble too. There was no refrigeration. Cow's milk spoiled in a day or two. Cheese was common, but often sour, salty, and hard as a brick. Butter was precious and quickly went rancid in the heat. People used it anyway, because again, they had to. You'd find clumps of hair or bugs inside slabs of old cheese. But hunger doesn't care about hygiene. And yet, even among the filth and the famine, medieval people still tried to celebrate food when they could. They baked special bread for feast days. They made porridge for newborns. They sang songs about ale. It was about survival, but also connection. Families gathered around fires, sharing what little they had, telling stories with mouths full of gruel. Even in royal courts, food was a spectacle. Dishes were dyed bright colors with crushed herbs or minerals, turmeric for yellow, saffron for gold, spinach for green. They'd bake a pie and stuff live birds inside so that when it was cut open, the birds would fly out. People clapped. It was part of the show. Part. But here's the twist. Those grand feasts were deadly. Meat sat out for hours, covered in spices to hide the stink. There were no napkins or hand washing. Meat was undercooked or too salty. Servants dropped food, picked it up, and put it back on the table. Foodborne illness wasn't rare. It was expected. Nobles vomited after dinner. Diarrhea was just part of the meal process, and some banquet attendees simply died. One banquet in 1213 ended in mass poisoning. Some said it was political sabotage. Others blamed spoiled fish. Whatever the truth, dozens of nobles dropped dead before dessert. And yet, despite all this, food was still a source of pride. It defined your class. The more exotic the dish, the higher your status. Peacocks were served with their feathers reattached after cooking. Swans were roasted whole. Jellies molded into castles. Marzipan shaped like animals. It was wild. It was theatrical. It was ridiculous. And it often made people horribly sick. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the reality was far less theatrical. The peasant diet was repetitive. Pottage, bread, ale, pottage, bread, ale, over and over. For breakfast, lunch and dinner, vegetables like leeks, onions and cabbage were grown in little gardens. Sometimes a turnip or parsnip was thrown in, and if someone had meat, it was cause for gossip. Did you hear old Thomas got a squirrel? They're feasting tonight. Hunting in royal forests was illegal. Caught poaching, you could lose a hand or worse. So even meat was political. Even food, the thing we all need to live, was twisted into power and punishment. In monasteries, food was simpler but still strict. Monks ate in silence. Meals were often dictated by religious calendars. No meat on certain days. Fasting often. Meals had to be eaten quickly and quietly. No enjoyment allowed. Eating was a necessity, not a pleasure. Even their beer was mild to avoid worldly indulgence. But don't feel too sorry for the monks. Some of them found loopholes. Fish counted as non-meat, so they ate beavers. Yes, beavers. Because they lived in water, someone decided they counted as fish. So roasted beaver tail became a fasting day delicacy. You can't make this up. And the poor just watched it all from the outside, literally. Sometimes peasants would gather outside monastery gates, hoping for scraps, leftover bones, rotten bread, slop, anything to make it through the night. Children begged with empty bowls. Mothers made soup with just water, salt, and hope. That's the tragic beauty of it all. They survived anyway. Now let's talk about something even worse than rotting food, famine. Because medieval food didn't just suck. Sometimes it didn't exist at all. When crops failed, and they often did, entire communities starved. A single bad harvest could mean death for thousands. In 1315, the Great Famine swept across Europe. Torrential rain drowned fields. Grain rotted. Livestock diseases spread. There was no backup plan, no food banks, no international aid. People ate bark, grass, even dirt to survive. Parents abandoned children they couldn't feed. Bodies piled up on the sides of roads. Some were buried in shallow pits without coffins. Some weren't buried at all. There were even whispered stories of cannibalism. Desperate villagers digging up graves for a final, horrifying meal. Nobody wanted to believe it, but everyone feared it was true. And when famine didn't strike, disease did. The Black Death arrived just a few decades later and wiped out millions. Farmers died, bakers died, even the people who made the ale died. The food system collapsed again. In some villages, there were no animals left to butcher. The fields went untended. Orchards overgrew. And those who survived often found their food even worse than before. Rancid, old, or simply not enough. And yet, food was political too. Kings and lords hoarded grain in storehouses. They could let the people starve or release the grain and look like saviors. But it came with strings: obedience, loyalty, silence. Starvation wasn't just a tragedy, it was a tool. And food was deeply religious. People believed famine was divine punishment. God was angry, the saints were displeased. So instead of planting better crops or managing stores, people prayed harder. They fasted. They whipped themselves in the streets. Some joined religious cults that marched barefoot across frozen ground, bleeding and crying out for mercy. And still, if the rains didn't stop, the food didn't come. Even when people weren't starving, they were paranoid. They feared bread curses, the idea that someone could hex your food. Superstitions ran wild. Some believed old women could spoil milk with a glare or make your bread rise with demons. If your stew curdled, maybe it wasn't bad meat, maybe it was witchcraft. And guess what? This paranoia led to real violence. Women were burned or drowned for ruining harvests or souring beer. Entire communities turned on each other because the rye crop failed. They didn't blame the weather. They blamed the neighbor with too many cats. And speaking of rye, here's something you probably didn't know. In certain damp conditions, rye can grow a toxic fungus called ergot. When consumed, it causes terrifying hallucinations, convulsions, vomiting, and death. It's chemically similar to LSD. People who unknowingly ate ergot-infected bread could go insane. They'd see demons, hear voices, twist in agony. Some historians believe outbreaks of ergot poisoning explain stories of demonic possession or mass hysteria in medieval villages. The Salem witch trials. Ergot poisoning is one theory. Imagine that, people being burned alive because their neighbors ate bad bread and started hallucinating. Food didn't just suck, it ruined lives. Now let's zoom in again, back to the peasant kitchen, or rather the peasant fire pit. Because most peasants didn't have kitchens, just a fire on the ground and maybe a clay pot. No counters, no utensils, no recipes. They threw everything into one pot and hoped for the best. Boiled barley, bits of onion, maybe a bone if they were lucky. They ate out of wooden bowls and wiped their hands on their clothes. Knives were prized possessions, and not everyone had one. Forks didn't become common until much later, and even then they were seen as suspicious. In fact, some clergymen believed forks were the devil's tool. Why? Because God gave you fingers, and stabbing food with a tiny trident seemed unholy. So people kept eating with their hands, and licking them, and passing food around communal tables. One dirty hand into a pot could mean illness for everyone. And water. Don't even think about it. Drinking water straight from a stream could kill you. It was often polluted with human waste, animal carcasses, or worse. So people drank ale, even for breakfast. Ale was safer because it had been boiled during brewing. Kids drank it. Monks drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Some households brewed their own weak ale, called small beer, just to survive. And if the ale ran out, they were in trouble, because sober, starving, and sick is not a good combination. Even feasts couldn't escape these problems. Imagine a noble wedding in the winter. Dozens of guests packed into a hall lit by torches. Trays of roasted meat, stews, and bread are passed around. It looks grand, but the meat is undercooked. The stew's been reheated 3 times. The bread is rock hard, and the wine is sour. No one says anything. They just smile, eat, and pray they don't die in the outhouse later. Food poisoning wasn't rare. It was a part of life. Now imagine you're a traveler. You've just walked 30 miles on a muddy road. Your feet are soaked. Your stomach is empty. You finally reach a village, just as the sun sets, and knock on the door of a roadside tavern. It smells like sweat, wet hay, and old soup. The innkeeper offers you a meal, A bowl of what looks like brown paste. It's porridge, mostly oats. Maybe a carrot chunk if you're lucky. It's cold. There's a suspicious hair in it. But you eat every bite because there's no other option. And the bread. It's not bread like we know it. It's coarse, dense, blackened on the outside and chewy as leather. In poor villages it might be stretched with sawdust or ground acorns to make the flour last. You heard that right. Sawdust bread. Acorn bread. Tree bark bread. People weren't eating for taste. They were eating for survival. And sometimes not even that. Now let's talk about prisons. Medieval prisons weren't full of food trays and metal bunks. They were filthy stone holes, sometimes literally underground. And prisoners weren't fed by guards. If you wanted to eat, your family had to bring food to you. No visitors, no food. Some prisoners starved to death in total darkness. Rats ate better than they did. In fact, sometimes prisoners ate the rats. That's how bad things got. And speaking of rats, rats were everywhere, in kitchens, in pantries, in grain stores. They chewed through sacks and left droppings behind. Fleas from rats spread the Black Death. But killing them? That wasn't easy. Cats helped, unless someone accused them of being witches' familiars. Then they were burned and the rat problem got worse. Now back to the nobles. Surely the elite ate better, right? Yes, and no. They had access to meat, spices, imported goods, but their food was often more dangerous in other ways. Nobles loved extravagant dishes, swan roasted in its feathers, pies filled with live birds, brightly dyed jellies and molded sugar sculptures. It looked impressive. It was meant to show wealth and power. But there were no food safety regulations. Cooks guessed the temperature by hand. Meat sat out for hours or days before cooking. Some spices were fake, made with ground brick or red clay, and many of these fancy foods were drenched in sauces to hide spoilage. You might attend a royal banquet and end up vomiting blood the next morning. That wasn't uncommon. Rich people often suffered from gout, rotten teeth, and digestive issues because their diets were overloaded with fatty meats, sugar, and wine. Vegetables were seen as poor people's food. Fresh greens? Too humble, too plain. So they avoided them and paid the price. Meanwhile, monks and nuns, who were bound by strict fasting rules, often lived longer than nobles. Their food was simpler: porridge, lentils, bread. They couldn't eat meat every day, but they had cleaner habits. Some monasteries even had early forms of sanitation: lavender-scented water, dedicated herb gardens, and rules against filthy kitchens. But most people didn't have that luxury. Let's talk about fish. On Fridays and religious holidays, meat was forbidden. So everyone ate fish, except many lived far from the coast. What did they do? They ate salted, smoked, or pickled fish that had been transported for days or weeks in barrels. By the time it reached their plate, it smelled awful and tasted worse. Some of it wasn't even cooked again. They just scraped off the mold, poured vinegar on top, and hoped it wouldn't kill them. And if you were lucky enough to live by the sea, that didn't always mean fresh fish either. Fishermen had to gut and clean fish in open air, often without ice or clean water. Spoilage happened fast. Shellfish could kill. Eel might contain parasites. And nobody was checking anything under a microscope. Speaking of parasites, let's talk about worms. Many people in the Middle Ages had tapeworms, or roundworms, or both. Why? Because they ate undercooked meat, or raw vegetables washed in dirty water, or bread baked in infested ovens. You could live with a worm inside you for years without knowing. just slowly losing weight, feeling tired and getting sick. And some people vomited worms, others passed them during sleep. Doctors didn't know what to do. Sometimes they'd prescribe garlic or fasting. Sometimes they just bled you and prayed. Food wasn't fuel, it was a gamble. And the church didn't help much either. Yes, the church fed the poor sometimes, but it also imposed strict food laws, fasting days, no meat on holy days. Entire communities had to adjust their meals to follow the religious calendar. That meant even less variety and even more restrictions. If you broke the rules, it was considered a sin. You could be fined or punished. So people got creative. They declared beavers were fish so they could eat them on Fridays. They turned every fast day into a loophole. But even the loopholes were bleak, because if all you had was moldy cheese and watery porridge, calling a beaver a fish didn't help. Now let's take a closer look at how people tried to make food last, because preservation in the medieval world was a nightmare. There were no refrigerators, no freezers, no cling wrap. If you wanted to keep meat from rotting, you had to smoke it, salt it, dry it in the sun, or bury it in fat. And even then, the results were often questionable. Imagine biting into jerky so tough you nearly break a tooth, or salted pork so intensely preserved it's more salt than pork. People soaked it in water for hours just to make it edible. But even that didn't always work. Sometimes the meat turned black or green. Sometimes it crawled. You ate it anyway, because wasting food could mean starving. Vegetables weren't any easier to keep. Carrots, leeks, and onions might be dried or pickled, but the process was crude. The jars leaked. The brine was inconsistent. Sometimes the pickles exploded. Other times the vinegar failed, and mold grew over everything. Grain, the backbone of most diets, had its own dangers. In bad harvest years, desperate peasants ate moldy rye. But rye infected with ergot fungus wasn't just gross, it was lethal. Ergot caused hallucinations, gangrene, and seizures. It was called St. Anthony's fire, and entire villages suffered during outbreaks. Imagine thinking you're cursed or possessed, when really it was just your bread, and yet people kept eating it, because there was nothing else. Now let's visit a medieval kitchen. It's not like the cozy space we know today. There's no clean marble counter, no running water, no electric stove. Instead, it's a smoky, soot-covered corner of a stone building. A large pot hangs over an open flame. The walls are black. The air chokes with heat and the stench of boiling fat. Chickens walk around your feet. Dogs beg. A child picks up a dropped bone and starts chewing it. This isn't a sanitized place, it's chaos. And everyone's using the same knife for everything. Bread, meat, herbs, maybe even trimming toenails. Nobody's washing their hands. Not because they're lazy, but because they don't understand germs. The concept doesn't exist. A dirty hand is just a hand. Sickness spreads fast. Diarrhea is common. Vomiting is normal. People blame spirits or bad air or the moon. They never suspect the soup. Now let's talk about what they drank, because the water was often worse than the food. Rivers ran with waste. Latrines emptied into nearby streams. Wells were contaminated, so most people didn't drink plain water. They drank weak ale. Very weak, almost like sour tea. Even children drank it. But the brewing process wasn't clean. Bugs got into the barrels, mold formed on top. Sometimes it was safer to drink than water, sometimes it wasn't. Wealthier folks drank wine. But again, preservation was a problem. Wine turned to vinegar quickly, so they added honey, herbs, even chalk or lead-based powder to make it palatable again. Yes, lead, that sweet flavor, it was killing them slowly. And yet nobody noticed. They just kept sipping and smiling while their brains melted. Now imagine trying to celebrate a feast. You're a noble. You invite dozens of guests. A whole pig is roasted on a spit. There are pies, stews, jellies, fruit and song. But the meat wasn't properly cooked. The jelly contains raw eggs. The fruit is overripe. The pie crust is filled with minced organ meat and clotted cream that sat out for 8 hours. Everyone eats. Everyone claps. Everyone gets sick. Some vomit behind tapestries. Some clutch their bellies and groan. Some die later from infection or parasites. And the servants? They eat the leftovers. It's a disaster wrapped in velvet. Now step outside the castle and back into the peasant village. A family of 6 shares a bowl of stew. There's one spoon, one chunk of meat between them. They all eat from the same dish. The baby drools into it. The dog licks the rim. There's no soap, no napkins. The wooden bowl is cracked and splintering. One child is already sick with fever, but still eats. The family says grace. They're thankful to have food at all, because they know there might not be any tomorrow. So now you're probably wondering, was there any comfort food in the Middle Ages? Something warm, tasty, and safe? Well, it depends on how low your standards are. For peasants, comfort food meant pottage. A mushy, watery stew made from whatever you could scrounge up. Barley, cabbage, onions, maybe a turnip. If you were lucky, a scrap of bacon or a bone with some grease still on it. It simmered all day over the fire. New ingredients were added as they came. Old ones were never fully removed. The pot was never cleaned. In some homes it bubbled for weeks. This wasn't a recipe, it was a lifestyle. A spoonful could contain fresh carrots, or week-old meat, or a dead bug that fell in while you were sleeping. Still, people called it the poor man's feast, because it was hot, filling, and better than starving. For the rich, comfort food looked fancier, but still followed the same medieval logic. More spectacle than taste. They loved subtleties, strange decorative dishes meant to impress, not satisfy. Picture this, a pie that looks normal, but when you cut into it, live birds fly out. Yes, that was a real thing. Or a roasted swan dressed back up in its own feathers. Looks majestic, tastes like greasy rubber. They even made jellies shaped like castles, stained with saffron and gold leaf. Pretty to look at, weirdly bland, and probably lukewarm by the time it reached your mouth. And spices, oh, they used a lot of them, but not to enhance flavor. They used spices to cover the rot. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, imported at high cost from faraway lands, dumped into sauces to disguise the smell of meat that was a little too aged. So even when a dish looked royal, it might have been masking something deeply questionable. Now let's talk about desserts. Did people eat sweet things in the Middle Ages? Yes, but you had to be rich. Sugar was rare, expensive, imported from the Middle East or North Africa. It was sold in hard loaves you had to scrape with a knife. So most desserts relied on honey. They made honey cakes, fruit tarts, and marzipan sculptures. Again, more visual than delicious. And sometimes desserts were downright terrifying. Like a pastry shaped like a human baby, or molded into strange animals. It was art, but it was weird. The average peasant, meanwhile, considered a ripe apple a sweet treat, or maybe a slice of bread dipped in milk, assuming they had bread, and assuming the milk wasn't sour. Spoiler, it often was. Let's not forget fasting, a huge part of medieval food culture. Religious fasting wasn't just spiritual, it was a dietary necessity. The church required hundreds of fast days per year when people couldn't eat meat, dairy, or eggs. So what did they eat instead? Fish. Lots of fish. But again, not fresh fish. Often salted, dried or pickled. Sometimes rehydrated and cooked into gelatinous slop, or layered with spices and served cold. Monks ate eels. Poor villagers caught frogs or snails. Nobles had stockpiles of preserved sturgeon and whale meat. Yes, whale, because the church decided whales counted as fish. Go figure. So people choked down rubbery whale blubber in the name of God, and probably regretted it for days. And here's the twist. Fasting wasn't optional. Breaking the rules meant punishment, public confession, fines, or worse, being labeled a sinner. That was a big deal in a world where eternal damnation felt real. Now imagine being pregnant, or sick, or starving, and still having to pretend you were okay with eating fish pudding for the 100th time. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was oppressive. And somehow it was considered holy. Let's talk about kitchens, or what passed for them. Because medieval kitchens weren't the warm, cozy heart of the home. They were terrifying fire traps. Most peasant homes didn't even have a separate kitchen, just an open hearth in the center of a single room. Smoke filled the air. Soot covered everything. There were no chimneys at first, just a hole in the roof, if you were lucky. If you stood too close, your clothes could catch fire. Too far, and your food didn't cook. There were no knobs to adjust heat, no timers, just instinct, firewood, and hope. The rich had dedicated kitchens in their manors and castles, but even those were dangerous. The fires were bigger, the ovens hotter, grease fires were common, and the buildings were often detached from the main hall to avoid burning the entire estate down when, not if, a fire broke out. And you know who worked in those kitchens? Children. Poor, exhausted, overworked children. Scullery boys, spit-turners, pot scrubbers. They worked next to open flames, boiling cauldrons, sharp knives, and angry cooks. Some went blind from the smoke. Some died in kitchen accidents. Some were beaten if they dropped a plate. Cooking wasn't a fun family activity. It was manual labor. Hazardous, stressful, and loud. And let's not forget the vermin. Rats were everywhere, so were mice and cockroaches and maggots. Food was stored in barrels or sacks, sometimes hung from the ceiling to keep pests out. It didn't work. Cheese came with worms. Bread came with weevils. Meat came with flies. No refrigerators, no Tupperware. Just salt, smoke, vinegar, and luck. Even noble households struggled to keep things clean. Cats were kept around not as pets, but as pest control. Dogs too, but they weren't exactly hygienic either. They tracked in dirt, fleas, and worse. And if you think the servants were washing their hands regularly, think again. Soap was rare, water was cold, and most people believed that bathing too often made you sick. So you've got unwashed hands touching raw meat, rolling dough, stirring pots, then wiping noses and going right back to chopping onions. It's amazing anyone survived. And speaking of survival, let's talk plague food. When the Black Death swept through Europe, food systems collapsed. Fields went untended, markets shut down, cattle died. But people still needed to eat. So what did they do? They ate whatever they could find. Cats, dogs, rats, leather, bark, grass. Sometimes each other. Desperate rumors spread of parents eating their children, or grave robbers boiling corpses. Was all of it true? Maybe not. But some of it absolutely was. In some areas, the dead outnumbered the living. Survivors foraged through ruins, risking infection just to find moldy bread or a rotten apple. And the worst part? The church told people it was their own fault. Their sins caused the plague. Their greed, their pride, their gluttony. So if you were starving, it was God's judgment. and if you didn't die from hunger, you might die from guilt. The only relief came from odd superstitious remedies, like eating powdered emeralds, or drinking vinegar laced with mercury, or swallowing live spiders wrapped in dough. Yes, that was real medieval medicine. Welcome to the dinner table. Let's talk manuscripts, because believe it or not, some of the strangest recipes we have from medieval times came straight from monks. Monasteries weren't just centers of prayer, they were centers of preservation, of ancient texts, medical knowledge, and food. But don't let that fool you. Medieval monks had weird diets. Some orders banned meat completely. Others banned it only from four-legged animals, which led to hilarious loopholes. Beavers, for example, were considered fish. So monks would happily roast beaver tails during Lent, pretending they were being holy. Otters also fish, puffins same. One bishop in France even declared barnacle geese were fish because people believed they hatched from driftwood. So on Fridays, monks feasted on goose because theology said it didn't count. But even these holy loopholes didn't make the food taste better. Most monk meals were a sludge of boiled grains, leeks, onions, and herbs. No garlic, no pepper, no spices. Just boiled everything. And it had to be eaten in silence. Monks dined in cold stone halls with a brother reading scripture aloud. No talking, no laughing, just slurping stew while someone recited death and damnation. If a monk farted, he had to write it down as a sin. If he licked his spoon, same thing. Food was seen as temptation, hunger as a test from God, which meant meals weren't supposed to be enjoyable. They were supposed to be discipline. But monks weren't alone in their strange food beliefs. Let's head back outside to the village fairs. Once or twice a year, peasants would celebrate feast days. There would be dancing, music, cheap wine, and food stalls, but not the kind you're imagining. Forget hot dogs and cotton candy. Try pig's bladder filled with blood, or a cow's udder boiled, then fried, or roasted porpoise if you lived near the coast. And they had a thing called mock meats, made from almond paste or mashed beans, sculpted into the shape of animals. People thought this was hilarious. Eating a fake chicken leg during Lent? Comedy gold. But it wasn't just peasant food that was weird. Let's go into a royal banquet. Now this is where it gets insane. Her medieval noble's feast was more about status than flavor. The dishes were designed to impress, not nourish, like a swan redressed in its own feathers after roasting, or a boar's head, stuffed with spices and apples, placed in the center of the table with a dagger through its skull. Or how about a cockantrice, a monstrosity made by sewing the front half of a pig to the back half of a goose, or vice versa, then roasting it and serving it whole. These were the medieval equivalents of Instagram food. Looks wild, tastes terrible, and if you were a guest, you'd better pretend to love it, because refusing a dish could be seen as an insult to your host and a death sentence if you were dining with a paranoid king. Remember, this was a time when poisoning was a real fear. Royal tasters were a legit job. Their entire purpose was to take the first bite, so if the food was laced with arsenic, they'd die instead of the Lord. Some tasters didn't last long, and that's not even counting the drinks. Wine existed, sure, but most of it was sour, gritty, and had to be mixed with spices or honey to be drinkable. Barley was the common drink even for children, but it spoiled quickly and sometimes went bad mid-feast. Still, they drank it because water was worse. Water could kill you. Streams were full of waste. Wells were contaminated. So people drank weak beer, sometimes all day, just to avoid cholera. Imagine chugging lukewarm barley water at breakfast, again at lunch and again at dinner. every single day. Your options were get drunk or get sick. This was the reality for most of the population. And if you were in a colder region of Europe, things got even worse. No spices, no olive oil, no citrus. Just root vegetables, dry bread, and maybe salted herring if you could afford it. And they tried to preserve things with honey, lard, or ashes. Yes, ashes. Some people rubbed ashes on meat to keep flies away. Others buried food in cold earth or snow, but that only worked in the right seasons. In summer, good luck. Spoiled food wasn't thrown out. It was eaten anyway. Mold was scraped off, sour milk was turned into cheese, green meat was stewed until it looked gray again. The logic? If it didn't smell like death yet, it was probably fine. So now you're probably wondering, how did anyone survive this madness? The short answer, they didn't, not for long. The average peasant didn't live past 35. And food, or the lack of it, was a huge reason why. Because here's something wild. People weren't just hungry in the Middle Ages, they were constantly, chronically underfed. And it wasn't just about poverty or bad weather. It was about a whole system that prioritized landowners, lords and religious elites, while everyone else scrambled for crumbs. See, most peasants didn't own land. They worked the land for their lords. That meant the crops they grew, wheat, barley, oats, weren't for them. They had to give a portion of it to the local noble, another chunk to the church, and keep just enough to survive. Barely. But what if the harvest failed? That wasn't rare. A bad rain, a cold snap, or an invasion could wipe out the entire year's crops. And when that happened, no food bank, no grocery store, no backup plan. People starved. Straight up. Between 1315 and 1317, Western Europe was hit with a massive famine. Crops failed 3 years in a row. People ate tree bark. They ground up dried animal dung and mixed it with flour. And yes, there are written accounts of cannibalism. Parents abandoning children. Children digging up corpses. People murdering neighbors just to eat their salted remains. And this was before the Black Death hit. So yeah, medieval food wasn't just gross. It was a matter of life and death. Even when there was food, it didn't mean much nutritionally. Take bread, for example, the staple of the peasant diet. You might think, oh, bread sounds fine. But this wasn't warm, fluffy bakery bread. This was hard, dark, gritty stuff, baked with whatever was available. Sometimes it had bits of stone in it from the grindstones. And yes, people's teeth would crack from eating it. Some loaves were stretched with sawdust, bean flour, or even clay. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to make it last. Flour itself was unstable. Stored in open sacks, it attracted rats, weevils, and maggots. And again, if you think they just threw it out, you don't understand medieval life. They used it anyway. A few worms in your meal? You were lucky to have the meal at all. Even nobility wasn't safe from this mess, because food safety as we know it didn't exist. No expiration dates, no refrigeration, no concept of bacteria. You might walk into a noble feast and smell something off, but they'd just cover it with more cloves, nutmeg, or vinegar. Rotten meat. Just boil it in wine and pretend it's gourmet. That's not an exaggeration. There are entire cookbooks from the time that recommend doing exactly that. One book from the 14th century actually says, and I quote, "If the flesh stinketh, wash it in strong vinegar and boil it well with hot spices." Translation: cook the stink out of it and hope nobody dies. And remember, noble kitchens were not clean. The floor was mud. The workers were mostly untrained boys. Pigs and dogs roamed freely through the halls. Food sat out for hours. Utensils were rarely washed. One English noble was famous for having a rat problem so bad they had to hang their bread from the ceiling to keep it from being eaten. Meanwhile, the lower classes had their own creative nightmares. In some parts of Europe, there was a thing called bread famine, not because there was no flour, but because the lords raised prices so high the poor couldn't afford it. So people started eating fake bread made from bark, moss and lichen. It filled their stomachs, but it ripped apart their insides. Chronic stomach pain, vomiting and internal bleeding were common symptoms. But still, people ate it because that's all they had. Now let's say you somehow got a proper meal. You're sitting down to eat your cabbage stew or your watery porridge, and suddenly you hear scratching. Rats. They were everywhere. In the pantry, in the flour sack, in the walls, even inside the oven. And yes, sometimes in the pot. There's a 12th century account of a cook boiling stew when a rat fell in, and he just kept cooking. Why waste a whole pot of food over one dead rat? Another tale tells of cat meat being secretly sold at markets, passed off as rabbit or lamb. And you know what? Most people didn't care. They couldn't afford to be picky. Meat was meat. And if it was salted enough, you could barely taste the difference. But wait, it actually gets worse. Because when food didn't kill you through starvation or parasites, it came for you another way. Poison. Not deliberate poison, accidental, silent, creeping, everyday kind. Let's talk about lead. In some parts of Europe, people used pewter plates, jugs and mugs, all of which contained lead. Pour in something acidic like wine or vinegar. The lead would slowly leach into the drink. And if you drank enough of it, it could cause madness, paralysis, and even death. Symptoms included vomiting, blackened teeth, and a slow, agonizing decline. There's even a theory that many nobles, especially in the later Middle Ages, suffered from chronic lead poisoning, and that it contributed to irrational political decisions. And don't think ceramic dishes were any safer. Glazes back then were often made with arsenic, mercury, or antimony. Substances we now know to be incredibly toxic. But back then they just thought, oh, this dish is shiny, fancy. Now imagine a room full of sweating nobles eating rotten pheasant off arsenic-laced platters, drinking lead-laced wine, all while the servants in the corner cough up blood from last week's spoiled eel. It was a full-body horror show, and no one even realized it. And then there were the diet trends. Yes, even in medieval times, people tried to eat clean. Monks, for example, often practiced strict fasting routines. Some only ate once a day or gave up meat entirely. Sounds noble, right? Except they made up for it by gorging on fish and beer, sometimes consuming over 6,000 calories a day in liquid and fatty meals. Their version of fasting often led to obesity, gout, and digestion problems. In fact, one monk wrote that his brothers were so bloated during Lent they couldn't even pray properly because they kept falling asleep. But at least they didn't have to deal with the open-air markets, where disease spread like wildfire. Picture it. Muddy streets, garbage piled everywhere, people selling meat from wooden carts with no cover, no ice, and flies crawling over everything. You'd see raw chicken next to leather shoes, moldy cheese next to buckets of urine used in tanning leather, and a sickly man coughing into a basket of apples. That apple, it'd still end up in someone's dinner, and if you got sick from it, good luck. There were no real doctors, just barber surgeons, local healers, or if you were lucky, a monastery that might prescribe a mixture of goat dung and honey to smear on your chest. Spoiler, it didn't work. So how did this nightmare finally end? Well, it didn't really end, but it slowly changed. Over centuries, better farming practices, cleaner markets, and actual understanding of disease started improving things. By the Renaissance, trade routes opened up. Sugar, chocolate, potatoes, tomatoes, and spices flooded into Europe. People started developing real flavor again. But for the average medieval person, they never saw any of that. They died with a belly half full of porridge, a few cracked teeth from gravel bread, and a prayer that tomorrow's stew wouldn't kill them. So next time you throw a microwave meal in the bin because it's bland or complain about airport food, just remember, someone in 1347 ate dried rat on stale rye bread with a side of boiled moss while rats ran across their feet and their neighbor coughed up blood from the plague. And they called that dinner. Medieval food didn't just suck, it tried to kill you every single day.